There's something happening right now, something you can't see, something you can't hear, but somehow you can feel it, like a quiet pull in your chest, like a thought that keeps returning without you calling it, like an emotion that doesn't fully belong to your present moment. And that's what makes this so difficult to ignore, because it doesn't feel like imagination, it feels like connection, like something is reaching you without words, without explanation. And if you've been noticing this lately, if you've felt a sudden wave of emotion, a memory that came out of nowhere, a sense of heaviness that you couldn't trace back to anything in your own life, then you're already aware of it in a way you can't fully explain. And that awareness is where this begins, not in something obvious, but in something subtle. Something that doesn't demand your attention, but stays long enough that you can't completely dismiss it. Because this connection, it never truly ended the way you thought it did. It didn't close with clarity. It didn't give you a clean separation. It just became quiet. And quiet doesn't mean gone. It just means hidden. It means something is still there, but no longer visible in the same way. And that's what makes it harder. Because when something ends clearly, your mind can process it, it can accept it, it can move forward, but when something becomes quiet instead of ending, it leaves space. Space for thoughts, for questions, for feelings that don't have a place to go. And those feelings don't just disappear, they stay, they shift, they resurface at unexpected moments. And that's what you've been experiencing. Not something new, but something that never fully left. And maybe what makes this even more intense is that you've tried to move forward. You've tried to focus on your own life, to let things settle, to convince yourself that whatever this was belongs in the past. But despite all of that, something keeps returning, not constantly, not in a way that overwhelms you every second, but in small moments, in quiet thoughts, in feelings that appear when you least expect them. And that's what makes it different, because random thoughts fade quickly. But this doesn't. This stays just long enough to make you pause, just long enough to make you wonder, just long enough to remind you that something about this connection was never fully resolved. And what you may not realize is that this isn't just happening on your side. Because connections like this don't exist in one direction, they don't leave an imprint on only one person. They exist between two people, even if they are not physically present in each other's lives anymore, even if there is distance, even if there is silence. The emotional imprint remains, and that imprint can resurface in ways that are not always visible, not always expressed, but still real, still active in a quiet internal way. Because the person you've been thinking about, the one who felt different, the one who left something behind that you couldn't fully explain, may be going through something right now that they don't know how to express, something they've been holding in, something they've been trying to ignore or suppress, but emotions don't stay hidden forever. They find a way to surface, even if it's only internally. Even if it's only in moments where they are alone, where they are not distracted, where they can't avoid what they feel anymore. And that's where the silence becomes meaningful. Because silence doesn't always mean absence. Sometimes it means something is too heavy to be spoken. Something is too complicated to be expressed openly. Something exists but doesn't have a place in reality where it can be acknowledged without consequences. And that's the kind of silence this connection may be existing in right now. Not empty, but full. Full of things that were never said, full of emotions that were never fully explored, full of thoughts that were pushed aside because they didn't fit into the life they were living. And when something like that builds over time, it doesn't just disappear, it accumulates, it grows in quiet ways. Becomes something that sits in the background until something triggers it. A memory, a moment, a realization, something that brings it back into focus. And when that happens, it can feel overwhelming, because it's not just one emotion, it's everything that was left unresolved returning at once. And that's where the feeling of them crying in silence begins to make sense. Not necessarily in a literal way, but in an emotional way, in the sense that they are processing something deeply, something they can't easily share, something that affects them more than they would show on the surface. And that kind of emotional state doesn't always look obvious from the outside. It can exist behind normal behavior, behind routines, behind a life that appears stable, but internally it can feel very different. Well, because people don't always express what they feel, especially when it conflicts with their current reality, especially when it involves something from the past that they believe they should have moved on from. And that's where the struggle happens, between what they feel and what they think they should feel, between what they want to acknowledge and what they try to ignore, and that internal conflict can create a kind of emotional tension that doesn't have an easy release. And that's where your awareness connects to it, not in a way that is obvious, not in a way that can be proven, but in a way that is felt. Because when two people share a connection that has depth, that has emotional significance, there is often a level of awareness that remains, even when there is distance, even when there is silence. And that awareness can show up in subtle ways, in thoughts that feel out of place, in emotions that don't fully belong to your current situation, in a sense that something is happening, even if you don't have direct evidence of it. And this is where things become both meaningful and confusing, because part of you recognizes that something is there, something that hasn't fully disappeared, but another part of you questions it, wonders if it's just your own mind revisiting the past, and that conflict can make it difficult to fully trust what you feel. Because without clear confirmation, it's easy to doubt something that is not visible. But here's the deeper truth. Whether they are actively thinking about you right now or not, whether they are consciously aware of what they feel or not, or the connection itself has already existed in a way that cannot be erased, and that means it can resurface. It can be felt again. It can influence both of you in ways that are not always direct or obvious. And maybe that's what this moment is about, not proving that they are crying for you, not turning this into something dramatic or exaggerated, but recognizing that something real existed, something that left an emotional imprint, something that didn't fully resolve, and that kind of connection doesn't just disappear without leaving something behind. And that's where your role becomes important, not in trying to figure out exactly what they are feeling, not in trying to confirm something that may not be fully visible, but in understanding what this connection is doing to you right now, how it is affecting your thoughts, your emotions, at your awareness, because while it may feel like it's about them, it's also about you, about what this connection represents in your life, about what it has shown you, about your own depth, your own emotional awareness, your own ability to feel something beyond surface-level interactions. Because at the end of the day, what matters most is not just what they are feeling in silence, but what you understand about this connection in your own awareness. Because that understanding is what allows you to carry it without being overwhelmed by it, to acknowledge it without being pulled back into it, and to recognize that not everything that is felt needs to become something that continues. Because sometimes the meaning of a connection is not in its continuation, but in the impact it leaves behind. Now, and as you sit with that feeling a little longer, something begins to shift, not in the connection itself, not in what they may or may not be going through, but in how you start to understand it. Because when something emotional lingers this deeply, when it returns in quiet waves instead of fading away, it's not just asking to be felt, it's asking to be understood. And that understanding doesn't come from trying to reach them or trying to confirm what they're feeling. It comes from turning your awareness inward, from noticing what this connection is revealing about you right now, in this moment. Because while it may feel like this is about them, about their silence, about what they are holding in, there is also a part of this that belongs to you, a part that is connected to your own emotional memory, at your own experience of what this connection was, and that's where things start to become clearer. Because when you separate what is yours from what might be theirs, you begin to see that the feeling you're carrying right now is not just about guessing what they feel. It's about recognizing what you felt and what still exists within you as a result of that experience. And that realization doesn't take away from the connection. It doesn't make it less meaningful. It actually brings more clarity to it, because now you're not trying to chase something outside of you. You're understanding something within you, something that has stayed because it mattered, something that hasn't disappeared because it was never superficial to begin with. And that's what makes this kind of connection different. It doesn't just pass through your life, and it leaves something behind, something that becomes part of your awareness even after the situation itself has changed. But this is also where things can become complicated, because when a connection stays present in this way, it can blur the line between what is happening now and what was felt before. It can make you feel like something is still active, when in reality, it may be your own memory and emotional imprint resurfacing, and that doesn't make it any less real. But it does mean that the source of the feeling might not be exactly where you think it is, and understanding that difference is what helps you stay grounded instead of getting lost in assumptions. Because it's easy to interpret these moments as signs, to believe that if you feel something strongly, it must be coming from them, that it must mean they are thinking about you, missing you, struggling in silence, and while that can sometimes feel true, it's important not to build your understanding entirely on that idea, because doing so can keep you tied to something that isn't clearly present in your reality, and that's where confusion begins to grow instead of clarity. And this is where your awareness becomes your guide, because instead of focusing on what they might be feeling, you begin to ask yourself a different question. Why is this coming up for me now? What does this feeling represent in my life at this moment? What part of me is being reminded of something that hasn't fully settled? And those questions bring you back to something more real, something more stable, something you can actually understand without needing to rely on something outside of your control. Because the truth is, emotional connections don't always need the other person to be actively present in order to be felt. They exist in your memory, in your nervous system, in the way your mind associates certain feelings with certain people. And those associations can be triggered by many things, by a thought, by a moment of stillness, by a change in your own emotional state. And when that happens, it can feel like the connection is active again, even if nothing has changed externally. And that's not something to dismiss, but it is something to understand, because once you recognize that part of this feeling comes from within you, it gives you more clarity. It allows you to hold the connection in a way that doesn't pull you back into uncertainty. It allows you to feel it without needing to explain it through something that may or may not be happening on the other side. And maybe that's the deeper meaning of this moment. Not that they are crying for you in silence in a literal sense, but that something about this connection is being brought back into your awareness for a reason. Not to confuse you, not to keep you stuck, but to help you understand something more clearly, something that you may not have fully processed before. Something that is ready to be seen in a different light now. Because when something returns like this, it's often not about going back. It's about seeing it differently, about understanding it from a place of growth, instead of from the same place you were in when you experienced it. And that shift is what allows you to move forward without carrying the same emotional weight. Because now you're not holding on to the connection as something unfinished. You're seeing it as something that had meaning but doesn't need to continue in order to keep that meaning. And that's where the sense of peace begins to form, not immediately, not all at once, but gradually, as you stop trying to define what they feel and start understanding what you feel, as you stop trying to confirm something external and start recognizing something internal. Because once you do that, the connection stops feeling like a question and starts feeling like an experience, something that happened, something that mattered, something that left an impression, but not something that needs to stay active in your present. And as you reach that point, you'll notice that the intensity of these feelings begins to shift, not disappearing completely, but becoming softer, less demanding, less confusing, because now you're not feeding them with uncertainty, you're holding them with understanding, and that changes how they exist within you. It changes how they affect you. It allows you to feel them without being pulled into them. And maybe that's the quiet truth behind all of this, that what you're feeling right now is not just about them. It's about the connection itself, about the way it impacted you, about the way it shaped your awareness, about the way it showed you something real, something meaningful, something that doesn't need to be proven or confirmed to exist. Because not everything that is felt needs to be explained through someone else's current emotions. Well, sometimes it's enough to recognize that it was real when it happened, that it left something behind, and that what you're feeling now is simply a reflection of that. Not a signal that something is happening again, but a reminder of something that once was. And once you understand that, something inside you settles, because you're no longer trying to reach something that isn't present. You're no longer trying to interpret something that isn't clear. You're simply acknowledging what you feel and allowing it to exist without turning it into something it doesn't need to be. And in that space, there is clarity. Not the kind that answers every question, but the kind that removes the need for those questions, because once you understand where something is coming from, you no longer need to chase it. You can simply let it be what it is. And that is what allows you to move forward without losing the meaning of the connection, but also without being held back by it anymore. And as that understanding begins to settle more deeply within you, something else starts to unfold, something that feels less like a question and more like a quiet acceptance. because you're no longer trying to chase the feeling or explain it in the same way. You're allowing it to exist without needing it to lead somewhere. And that shift is what changes everything. Because when you stop trying to turn a feeling into a story, into a conclusion, into something that has to mean more than it does, you give yourself space. Space to breathe, space to observe, space to understand without pressure. Because before this, every time the feeling came back, it pulled you into something, into thinking, into wondering, into trying to connect it to something happening right now. And that's what made it heavy, because it wasn't just a feeling, it became a question, and questions demand answers. They keep your mind active. They keep you looking for something to confirm what you're experiencing. And when those answers don't come, the feeling stays unresolved. And unresolved feelings are what create that sense of emotional tension that doesn't fully go away. But now you're starting to see that the feeling itself doesn't need to be solved. It doesn't need to be turned into something external. It can exist on its own, as a reflection of something that was real, something that mattered, something that left an imprint. And when you allow it to exist that way, without attaching it to what they are doing or feeling right now, and it becomes lighter, it becomes something you can hold without being pulled into it. And that's where the connection changes form completely. Because before, it felt like something unfinished, something that needed closure, something that was still active in a way that required attention. But now, it begins to feel like something complete in its own way, not because it continued, not because it turned into something more, but because you've understood it, because you've seen it clearly enough that it no longer needs to keep repeating itself in your mind. And that's what brings a different kind of peace, not the kind that comes from forgetting, but the kind that comes from understanding. Because once you understand something, you don't need to hold on to it in the same way. You don't need to revisit it over and over again. And it becomes part of your awareness instead of something that occupies your attention. And maybe that's what this moment has been leading you toward all along. Not toward confirming what they feel, not toward reconnecting or reopening something, but toward understanding what this connection meant in your life, what it showed you, what it revealed about your ability to feel, to connect, to recognize something meaningful even when it didn't fully unfold. Because not every connection is meant to continue in a visible way. Some are meant to stay as experiences. Some are meant to show you something about yourself. Some are meant to exist in a quiet space where they don't need to grow further in order to have value. And that doesn't make them less real. It just means their purpose was different. And once you begin to see it that way, the need to interpret every feeling, every memory, every moment of awareness begins to fade. Because you're no longer trying to turn it into something it isn't. You're allowing it to be what it was, something meaningful, something real, but something that belongs to a different time. And that's where your focus begins to return fully to the present, not because you're forcing yourself to move on, but because there is nothing left to figure out, nothing left to solve, nothing left to question in the same way, because the connection has already given you what it needed to give. And that understanding is what allows you to step forward without carrying the same emotional weight. And as you move forward, you'll notice that your awareness continues to change, that you begin to see connections differently, yet that you recognize the difference between something that is present and something that is remembered, between something that is aligned and something that existed under different circumstances, and that clarity becomes part of how you navigate everything moving forward. Because now you understand that depth alone is not enough, that a connection can feel strong and still not be meant to continue, that timing matters, that alignment matters, that reality matters just as much as emotion. And once you understand all of that, you're no longer drawn to the same kind of uncertainty. You're drawn to something clearer, something more stable, something that exists fully instead of partially. And that's where your growth becomes visible, not in forgetting what happened, but in how you carry it differently, how you no longer feel pulled back by it. Well, how you can think about it without being consumed by it, how you can acknowledge it without needing it to become something more. Because now, it's not something that controls your thoughts, it's something that exists in your understanding, something that shaped you, something that showed you a part of yourself you didn't fully see before. And that's what remains, not the confusion, not the uncertainty, but the awareness. And maybe that's the final truth of this connection. Not that they are crying for you in silence, not that something is happening right now that you need to respond to, but that something once existed that was meaningful enough to leave a mark. And that mark is what you've been feeling, not as a signal from them, but as a reflection of what was real between you. And once you understand that, everything becomes quieter. Not empty, but peaceful. Because you are no longer trying to reach something that isn't there. You're simply acknowledging what was. And in that acknowledgement, there is clarity. In that clarity, there is release. And in that release, there is space. Space for you to move forward without losing the meaning of what you experienced. Space for you to feel again, to connect again, to experience something new without being tied to something that has already served its purpose. And that's where everything finally settles. Not in a dramatic ending, not in a sudden realization, but in a quiet understanding that stays with you. One that doesn't need to be repeated, one that doesn't need to be questioned, one that simply exists as part of your awareness. And once you reach that point, you're no longer looking back in the same way. You're moving forward, not because you forgot, but because you finally understand.